Americans lose. I mean, let's say this first, and I have to say that, well, sorry, first thing, nobody wins in a tariff war. Nobody wins. But if you talk specifically, if Trump is jacking the tariffs up, it's those American importers of components that come in from China that have to pay higher cost. Um, that includes, by the way, Elon Musk, and it's one of the reasons why Elon Musk fell out with Trump. Uh, it is American manufacturers who pay higher cost because their input costs go up. It's American uh, farmers who pay the price on this, and it's American consumers.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've got Professor Scott Lucas from Clinton Institute at the University College Dublin on the show. Of course, you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube page, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcast. But today is a special Saturday episode. Scott, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Hey, thank you. It's great to be joining you on a Saturday.
We love a weekend episode when there is stuff going on. And of course, the news never sleeps in Trump land, so there's a lot to talk about. So Trump's trade war with China escalated on Friday. China, somewhat out of the blue, Scott, basically announced this week that new export restrictions on global supplies of rare earth and critical minerals would be introduced. These are crucial minerals, and of course, China dominates this industry. Many countries will be impacted, but the United States will be hit the hardest. So Trump basically retaliated by announcing that from November 1st, the US would double tariffs on Chinese imports, i.e. impose 100% tariff. He also threatened to impose export controls on critical software to China. China then came back, announced that it would charge export port fees on US-linked vessels docking in China starting from October 14th, so next week. Scott, you've got to walk me through this escalation.
Yeah, something's gone really pear-shaped beyond Trump's, abnormal chaos. Just a quick background check where we are. First of all, why are the rare earths so important? China controls 90% of the processing of rare earths, 90. They control 70% of the supply of rare earths. It's not like you can go to alternatives if they decide to drop the hammer on this, which they've done. Everybody thought that this was calming down over the summer. You might remember back in the spring when Trump had his magic charge of tariffs and everybody was going to get hit. I think he was up to 245% at one time on the Chinese, and the Chinese were like up to 145%. And then the adults in the room in the Trump administration, Scott Bessent, especially the Treasury Secretary, got in there and said, all right, look, probably do we really want to go to the mat with the Chinese? And they went into talks and everybody dropped the levels. So the level of U.S. tariff on Chinese products, 30%, China on U.S. only 10%. Now, here's what I honestly can't work out, Maddie, and I'm going to be interested if our great viewers can come in and help. And that is the last set of talks between the U.S. and Chinese delegations was in Madrid, and it was only several days ago, right? Now, and there was a rush of other things going on, so I may have missed it. I didn't see an update coming out of those talks. But we still thought everything's on course for Trump to do his big PR thing with Xi Jinping, who he tends to admire as president for life, because that's what he wants to be as well. And then China, for some reason, decided, all right, we're going to play hardball on the rare earths. Now, they didn't specifically name the U.S. in this, but you got to think that the U.S. has got to be one of the key targets. So did the talks go badly in Madrid? Does China think, all right, they can extract something specific out of the United States by using the stick rather than the carrot? Where's their calculation here? And again, on the other side, because the Chinese did this and Trump came back so quickly to react, I don't have the space to look at U.S. officials like a Scott Bessent and others reacting to the Chinese announcement in terms of how are they assessing it? How serious is it? Do they think the talks can still be put back onto an even keel? In other words, Trump has responded to the Chinese by just simply escalating and going ballistic. And the key thing here is I don't know if Trump did this just because it's Trump being Trump, or if this is an organized administration effort. All I can tell you is it does not bode well. And because in fact, yeah, because I think, the Chinese don't do this. They don't drop the hammer unless they think they're in a position where they can really make this stick. They're not making this like an empty threat. Now, that's going to make it more difficult for Trump to back them down. I don't think, that, as you mentioned, the Chinese, when he comes out, we're going to put 100% on this, they immediately come back and say, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And you ask yourself, where's the Trump administration's leverage against China? Because a quick reminder, if you just up tariffs on China, the first people who feel the pain of tariffs are not the Chinese. And they have a centrally planned economy. They can cover companies who get hit by this. The first person who feel the pain are Americans. And Americans who get hit by this are not going to be pleased with the Trump administration. Let me add one piece of context as well. Sorry, I keep going. There's one other piece of context. I apologize. I've been trying to work through it. Just before this hit, the interesting stories that were coming out of the States were the soybeans. How are soybeans interesting, Scott, you may say? Well, if you're a geek or a nerd, anything gets to be interesting. And that is that you have got vast warehouses and containers piling up with soybeans that were supposed to go to China, because China takes half of the U.S. soybean exports worth billions of dollars a year, and they're taking zero right now. That means in certain farm-producing states, there are farmers who are on the hook because their income's being jeopardized. And if you pay close attention, you'll see the Trump administration scrambling by saying, we'll help these farmers, we'll help them, we'll help them, we'll help them, without being very detailed on how are you going to help them if this continues. I think China saw they were getting leverage on the soybean issue, and they thought, all right, we're going to take it up a level.
Because it does feel like something has happened behind closed doors. What we know, Scott, as you mentioned this meeting the other day, but what we know is that tensions felt like they had eased between the US and China in the last few months. We saw that Xi Jinping and Donald Trump did speak on the phone in June, and that they'd organised for a sideline meeting at APEC, which will take place at the end of this month. So we also know, on top of that, was that Donald Trump seemed to be tiptoeing around placing tariffs on China for importing Russian oil, and had done it to India, but had been reluctant to do it to China. And we questioned why China got off scot-free on this. And a lot of analysts would say, well, he's trying to strike a great trade deal with China, and he's waiting until this APEC summit when he actually meets Xi Jinping and see what he can get out of him. So that's where we were at until this week, when that announcement was made, when this escalation happened on Friday with Trump's retaliation, and then subsequently China's retaliation back. So, Scott, you've said this before, but it just seems something went on behind closed doors, and this was almost premeditated on both sides.
Yeah, and I'm going to tell, because I kept looking for clues. So let me tell you something else that's interesting in terms of what is not being said. If you go to the main English language press today on this, apologies, can't read Chinese. I'm going to get some students to help me out next week to go even deeper on this. But if you go, for example, to Xinhua or to Global Times, they don't say a word about this. They don't even mention that the tariff increase that Trump put on, and they don't mention the Chinese threat on rare earth minerals. I think there is a reference in the Global Times to China would like multilateral trade. We'd like everybody to agree on it. The one outlet that does make an that does refer to Trump's tariffs, China Daily, says Trump increased tariffs on us, but it doesn't mention the rare earths. So it makes it look like Trump just did this because he's just like a bad guy. So the Chinese are not tipping their hand in terms of, I can't read between the lines on Chinese media on their play at this point.
Of course, as we kind of say that this came surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly to both parties, but to us, the average person, this came surprisingly, which of course meant that markets responded, Scott. The S&P 500 dropped 2.7% in just a single day, the steepest fall since April. Investors were dumping stocks in tech and manufacturing because, of course, this affects chips, and so on and so forth. So is this situation dire, or is it just temporary?
Depends on how long it goes on, Maddie. First of all, it's interesting. that very few people noticed that big drop in the markets because of Gaza, right? And that was, the way the news cycle works. I think when we get into Monday, and people are going to start to pay attention, especially if the markets have another dip out of this. And it is significant for the reason you have pointed out, which is this isn't just a fall in the stock market. This is a fall in terms of stocks, tech stocks, AI stocks. You talk about the Magnificent Seven, right? And the Magnificent Seven drive most of that increase, that stock growth. So to throw in another fact this week, I think it was the IMF just issued a report this week that said, look, despite all the turmoil, including Trump turmoil, including the Trump China, tension, you're still on for around more than 3% growth globally, right, in the next this year, and the U.S. for 2.5% increase in GDP, which you think Trump would want, given how much he's messing around and screwing up the economy. But what they said was interesting but a lot of this growth is driven by AI, so it's vulnerable. 11% of the growth in GDP in the first part of this year was because of AI. That's a big share of both the US and the global economy. So again, that's where China has special leverage. This isn't like, okay, fine, American farmers, and we don't want to downplay the pain to them, but it's not like pain to American farmers affects the global economy to a great extent. You hit AI and you hinder the potential for growth, that does have a big effect that ripples from the US and ripples to other areas of the world.
Trump says that he doesn't know if he's going to meet Xi now at APEC at the end of the month. So, Scott, just to wrap up really what's happening with this tariff war, how bad do you think this could get? And you mentioned this before, but who loses out more, Americans or Chinese?
Americans lose. I mean, let's say this first, and I have to say that, first thing, nobody wins in a tariff war. Nobody wins. But if you talk specifically, if Trump is jacking the tariffs up, it's those American importers of components that come in from China that have to pay higher cost. That includes, by the way, Elon Musk. And it's one of the reasons why Elon Musk fell out with Trump. It is American manufacturers who pay higher cost because their input costs go up. It's American farmers who pay the price on this. And it's American consumers who pay the price on it. Now, China takes a hit as well because they lose part of the U.S. market, and their people will have to pay more for U.S. goods, but it's a much different type of economy. Because of that amount of heavy central planning, you can absorb some of that shock that comes out of that. I will mention that China has had some issues, internal economic issues, growth issues, that are not related to the tariffs, that are for other reasons. So I'm not saying China gets away from the scot-free, but again, I don't think China makes this move on the rare earths if they think they're in a vulnerable position. I think they feel like they can ride out an extension, which means you're asking me where this goes next. It goes next because of two actors. It goes next on whether Trump backs down or whether the Chinese relieve the pressure. And here's why this is different from other cases. We are so used to the media narratives that it's Trump who calls the tune, and everybody has to kiss his backside or give way to an extent, like the EU did, like the UK did, like others did. People are not used to, Trump being the one who's on the defensive over this. That's not the way the narrative works. Well, he is on the defensive over this at this point, and that's why this makes it uncertain.
Well, do you think he handled this correctly, Scott? If you're looking at this diplomatically, but you're also looking about how this affects not just like global supply, global chain, everything, Americans, consumers, do you think the way he responded with retaliation straight away was the right move?
Huge risk. I mean, it's a huge risk. And whether it's Trump or whether it's the Trump administration that had decided this and then Trump vocalizes, it's a big risk because, you're getting into a point where it's a big risk because you and I discussed in the last conversation we had about the convergence of certain factors, right? So we've got a convergence which is going on. We've got a convergence which is a spike in the unemployment rate because you're going to get those federal government employees whose contracts ended on September 30th, and there's more than 100,000 of them. that took the deal, the forced resignations, they get added to the unemployment rolls. Now, we haven't seen that yet because the bureau that brings out the unemployment statistics is affected by the government shutdown. But that comes out. Trump's monkeying around with the tariffs on all fronts, not just the Chinese front, is driving inflation up. So that's starting to pick up a bit more. You're seeing the effect that I mentioned earlier on certain sectors of the US market that has to export abroad. So you're getting this convergence of all of this that I think comes in the next few months of this year. So Trump has just laid this on top of this, right? Now, if the Chinese back away, or if the Chinese compromise and he gets his PR appearance with Xi and a deal, then it's a gamble that works. But if the Chinese play hardball with him, where's his next move? Where's his next play? What's he going to say? I'm going to 150, 200%, 250%. And again, one fact, let's just remember that when this went around in April, when he was monkeying around in April with this and, tariffs up to 245%, back around, it was either May or June, you had key ports, U.S. ports like Seattle, like Los Angeles, where they were down 40% on their traffic that was coming in. That's a big economic hit if you have that long-term drop in traffic in terms of both import and export.
Let's move on to something else, something big happening this week, Scott, was, of course, earlier in the week we saw Hamas and Israel agree on this partial implementation of a 72-hour ceasefire while Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners are being released, as well as a partial withdrawal of Israeli troops out of Gaza. This is the first phase of Trump's 20-point peace plan agreed on and is now being executed across this weekend. So Trump will travel to Israel and Egypt on Sunday, but the next stage will be difficult. So how likely do you think it will be that Trump can pull this off with Israel and Hamas? And is it correct to say, do you think, I know I've asked you this off camera, but both Hamas and Trump's people both said once this was agreed upon, this first phase, that the war was now over. Now, only the first phase has been agreed upon, and it's going to be happening this weekend. So is the war over yet, the way they say it is? And how likely is it that we're going to move out of phase two and on to the next?
No, I mean, the conflict's not over. I mean, just because you cease fire over the weekend, and the one key thing that we get, and we have to hail this, it wasn't just Trump that brought this out. There are a number of actors who brought this about, and I'll explain in a minute how it came about but it's the hostage for detainees exchange. Let's just say this up front. Those 20 hostages who have survived more than 2 years in Hamas, being held by Hamas, they come home. They're alive. 28 bodies will come back. Families in Israel will get closure. It doesn't bring those loved ones back, but they'll get closure on this. 2,000 Palestinian detainees, including more than 1,700 who were swept up by the Israelis as they went through Gaza. They come back. Many of them are going to be reunited with families as well. And you don't want to downplay that happening. And again, I can go back into why that happened. It actually is not Trump being a peacemaker that brought this about. There's a much more interesting story to tell. But the fundamental here is that the rubber only begins to hit the road next week after Trump does his victory lap. He's going to do a victory lap. He's going to go to Israel on Monday. He's going to appear before the Knesset. Hi, it's me. It's Donald. We don't think at this point, it's not planned that he's going to Hostages Square, but I wouldn't be surprised if he makes a surprise visit there to get the acclaim. And then it said, he's going to chair a meeting on Gaza. The Israelis will not be there, but the Arabs will be there and other actors will be there, right? And that's going to be Trump for the cameras posing at this. Look, here's the reason. And this just goes beyond Trump, what you've got to look at. You have got key elements that are very vague in that sketch that was called Trump's sketch that have to be defined. It looks like aid is being defined. That's a first step. 600 trucks, daily basis. That takes us back to where we were before October 2023, and enough to keep Gaza ticking over, right? Then you talk about the extent of the Israeli withdrawal. Now, the Israeli Defense Forces are pulling back this weekend so that you get that exchange. that hostage for detaining exchange, but they still occupy 53% of Gaza. What is the timing and the extent of their further withdrawal? What is the timing and the extent of disarmament of Hamas in conjunction with that? What are the arrangements for governance and security in Gaza? The international board that Donald Trump is the chair of, I mean, that is just so vague. It has no Palestinian representation. The day-to-day administration to run Gaza, which would mean governance and security. Palestinians are supposed to be on it, but which Palestinians? It won't be Hamas. Israel has vetoed Palestinian Authority in the short term. For which Palestinians? Will Israel have veto over that? And let me give you one key thing that shows it how difficult it is. This deal almost came unstuck this weekend because Israel changed the names on the detainee list that were going to be released. Hamas, and not just Hamas, but many Palestinians wanted the release, for example, of Mariam Barghouti. Now, I doubt many people have heard of him. It's not like that's a headline name. He is one of the most important Palestinian leaders. The Israelis have kept him behind bars for more than 20 years. If he came out, he would be seen possibly as a leader of a future government in Palestine. And the Israelis, for that reason, don't want him out. That's the type of immediate sticking point you talk about. And then you've got to get these wider arrangements. And just a quick reminder, because I could go on for quite a long time about how difficult it is. 2 key points. One is, if you're going to have security in Gaza, who provides the security? Now, the Americans are making a big deal that they're sending 200 personnel, but they'll also, at the same time, not a single American will step foot inside Gaza. They're just going to oversee this from Israel. We are being told it's going to be Egyptian, Qatari, UAE, and Turkish forces. Let's see if that's the way that it pans out, because I don't have to tell you, that's a foreign force, even if it's an Arab, a Turkish and Arab force, in a country where a lot of people are still ticked off that they've had a mass killing for 2 years. And then the other point, even if all of this goes well, you do not get stability until you get to a 2-state resolution. And who are the two main actors who are against a 2-state resolution? Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump.
I mean, as you mentioned, the first phase is amazing that it's happening. It is amazing, but this is where real work begins from Monday. So we'll keep an eye on that for our viewers and listeners. Just moving on to a more lighter topic, Scott. Donald Trump and the White House, they aren't happy with the fact that he didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize. A White House aide said the committee proved they placed politics over peace. Now, I don't understand this because Trump was never going to win. Nominations were cut off on January 31. That is, 11 days after he was sworn in? He hadn't solved anything by then. He literally just returned to the Oval Office. He was never going to win.
We restate 2 fundamentals. 1, Donald Trump is obsessed with the fact that Barack Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he hasn't. 2, Donald Trump is a big old man baby, all right? And I'm just going to put that out there, that you can be in the same week acclaimed for being one of the actors involved in bringing a phase 1 settlement in Gaza, even if you only did that because Israel bombed Qatar a few weeks ago, something we can talk about in a second. You can do that in the same week and then completely undermine that by throwing your toys out of the pram, literally. Well, no, not literally, metaphorically, sorry. So anyway, what happens? Maria Corina Machado, Venezuelan industrial engineer who goes into politics, but she's a rights activist. One of the most impressive rights activists in the world, in the face of a Venezuelan government, the Maduro government, which is not exactly supportive of rights in so many areas, which is extremely repressive. She has persisted in putting forth the need for a much more decent, effective, responsible Venezuela for all Venezuelans. She did it even when they would not let her stand for public office. She did it even when she had to go into hiding because of threats from Maduro and the security forces. And so who recognizes that? Who recognizes that type of person? At the start of this year, Donald Trump recognized it, maybe for cynical motives, because the U.S. has long wanted to overthrow the Venezuelan government. But he says she's a fine person, fine leader of the opposition. Who else recognized it? Secretary of State Marco Rubio. We support Maria Corina Machado. So when the Nobel people came out with this, and I was just following it obsessively, I was just waiting for that announcement. I knew it wasn't going to be Trump, but it was like, okay, because the Nobel Peace Prize committee, I love it when they say we're apolitical. We're apolitical. We're apolitical. You're political as hell, right? And so the politics they play here is they don't give it to someone like the International Criminal Court, who had also been nominated, because that would have sent. You think Trump was ballistic if that had happened? Imagine if they gave it to the ICC when Israel hates the ICC, and the U.S. has sanctioned the ICC's prosecutors and judges because they actually try to enforce the law. So instead, they read out Machado's name, and I'm like, they've boxed Trump in. They boxed Trump in two ways. One is, if you look at the Nobel Prize statement, they frame it in a way without naming anybody who speaks about the need to stand up to authoritarian rulers. We need to stand up to authoritarian rulers. I'm like, oh man, that's a heck of a right hook you just threw at Trump, even if he might not realize it. And then, of course, what they've done is they've given it to someone where it's going to be very hard for Washington to push back because they support the Venezuelan opposition. But lo and behold, Trump sends out one of his lackeys, right? He didn't do it himself, at least. Sends out one of his lackeys to say, once again, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee has put a priority on politics over peace. Really? That's what you're going with? You've got a prominent rights activist who's recognized, someone whom you supported, and you're going to say that the Nobel Committee is nasty and underhanded? Because guess who jumps in next? All the way in Moscow, Bad Vlad, who's not having a good week. Bad Vlad looks at it and goes, Christ, I need an opening to swing the Americans over Ukraine and so on. The Nobel Peace Prize Committee has put a priority on politics. They are outmoded. How dare they do this? Donald Trump is a wonderful guy. and Donald Trump goes on to Truth Social and goes, thank you, President Putin, for saying, I'm like, you could not make this stuff up, right? And so, the serious side of this is that once again, as we should be talking about the need to get to decent, tolerant, respectful, nonviolent politics, the White House actually had a chance to be mature here and to stand up and to support what is going to be very important, not just in Venezuela, but across Latin America, because that's where people are noticing this, right? They're asking themselves, will the Trump administration stand on the side of supporting us against authoritarian rulers? And the Trump administration just gave a big old flat no, based solely because the leader is a man baby.
This is the reason why we're doing a Saturday episode, because so much happened on Friday and today. And let's get into this. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth on Friday, he announced that the United States was signing a letter of acceptance to build the Qatari Emiri Air Force facility in Mountain Home Air Base, Force Base in Idaho. So they would also host Qatari F-15 aircrafts and pilots. Hegseth said that he praised it and said this was just another example of our partnership with Qatar. But this was met with serious backlash, Scott, even from conservative MAGA supporters, including Laura Loomer and Steve Bannon, who questioned why you would host a foreign military base on American soil. So this backlash happened. Hegseth was then forced to downplay what he meant. And then he wrote on X saying, important clarification, the US military has a long-standing partnership with Qatar, including today's announcement cooperation. However, to be clear, Qatar will not have their own base in the United States, nor anything like a base. We control the existing base like we do with all of our partners. But even after all of this, conservatives are still angry, Scott, because they're saying Qatari military personnel will still be based and training on American soil. So what is this?
Okay. First of all, let me throw you a complete swerve here. And that is, I'm actually going to say that Pop Gun, he actually is the innocent in this case. Surprise, surprise. And I'm going to tell you a much more serious story, which is going to link to Qatar and link back to Gaza. The immediate story is that the Qatari Defense Secretary is over in Washington, and he does the press conference alongside Hegseth. And Hegseth is reading from a prepared statement, right? Whoever drafted the statement screwed up because they didn't. This is in Idaho. And what it is it is a facility that you train Qatari Air Force pilots on the use of F-35s, fighter jets, which the U.S. is giving to Qatar. And there's pretty good reason for that. Qatar doesn't have a huge amount of airspace. If you notice the country where it is, tucked away in the Gulf, and so you got more space up there in the American West. And when Hegseth reads it out, he does not use the word base. He used the word, that this is a Qatari Emiri facility, right? But the statement did not make clear that it was a facility under U.S. jurisdiction, right? In other words, it gave the misleading impression, oh, the Qataris have got their own little space here on U.S. soil. Now, it is quite common for foreign military personnel to be trained on U.S. bases. That's been there for many, many decades, right? Because you have great training facilities, so you bring your allies over, you train them up. And if they had explained that quite clearly, they would not have gotten nearly the heat that they did. But because it was a mangled statement, which they then had to clarify, you got, in particular, the raging Islamophobe Laura Loomer. Now, Laura Loomer has no elected position. She has no administrative position. She has no particular expertise, but she is the whisperer in the ear of the Trump administration when she decides that they need to get rid of somebody or that someone's transgressed them. So she goes on to X and calls out those millions of followers because she is an Islamophobe. How dare we have Muslims with a base on U.S. soil? And she's still at it today, even after the clarification. Well, that clearly puts the wind up the administration because, again, as we've talked about with the Epstein case, when it's your own people who are coming after you, right? And it's to the point today where Loomer's saying, I'm not going to vote for the Republican Party. And then other people are coming back who are saying, good, we don't care, off you trot. And so you just wonder how far that kind of goes, and we'll watch that. But here's the serious part of this, Maddie, which because this, you always got to watch about things that kind of distract from us. It's like, why are the Qataris getting this facility, and why are they getting such a high-profile announcement of it? And if you have a couple minutes, let me tell you a story that is a better story than who should get the Nobel Peace Prize. On September 9th, Israel violated the sovereignty of Qatar by trying to assassinate Hamas leaders that are there. Now, Israel trying to assassinate Hamas leaders, big damn deal. They've done that throughout the past 2+ years. Israel going into the territory of an American ally, which hosts the biggest American military base in the Middle East and has done so for quite a long time, and carrying it out, that's huge. Because not just Qatar, but the other Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and UAE, are looking at this and going, can we actually trust the Trump administration on anything if they're going to allow this type of crap to happen, right? So that's one factor. Here's the other factor that comes into play. You might have heard of a guy named Jared Kushner. He's been in the news recently. Donald Trump's son-in-law, and as the New York Times puts it, Jared Kushner, he used his New York real estate expertise to be able to swing the Gaza deal. Well, New York Times, whom I've not been happy with because they do your damn job, folks. Get to the story. Here's a New York real estate story with Jared Kushner. Phase 1. Jared Kushner was in trouble in 2016 because he was on the hook for almost $2 billion for a property in New York. 666. I think it was Fifth Avenue. I'll double check that later. He was trying to find finance for it to cover the fact that he could not cover the loans. Ultimately, he goes to Gulf states. One of the Gulf states that helps get Kushner off the hook on that loan, ding, 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 Qatar. But phase 2, when Jared Kushner, when Daddy is no longer in the White House, Kushner goes back into business. He launches a huge investment fund. That investment fund, which needs to turn a profit, who's bankrolling it? $2 billion from Saudi Arabia, $1.5 billion from Qatar. If this September 9th attack by Israel on Qatar threatened America's military position in the Middle East, America's alliances, and it threatened economic projects that include, by the way, a $5.5 billion Trump resort and golf course in Qatar. So something had to be done. The Gulf states, as well as Turkey, went back to the Trump people, which includes Trump, Jared Kushner, and let's not forget, Trump's envoy, real estate developer, Steve Witkoff, and said, if you don't do something about Netanyahu, everything is going to go up, even worse than it is now. And Trump, if you want to give him credit for this, then began to lean on Netanyahu. It was that convergence that brought us Gaza. But of course, while you have the Gaza story play out as we've just discussed, how does the U.S. play this out with Qatar? What they did before they announced this base is even more interesting and also caused some real ruction in Washington to watch. There is something called an Article 5 guarantee in NATO, where if one of NATO's members attacked, you come and provide assistance to that. The United States, for the first time, gave effectively a version of an Article 5 guarantee to a Middle Eastern state not named Israel, and that state was Qatar. In other words, if Israel attacks Qatar again, the United States gave the assurance they would come in and defend, right? So there's going to be a lot to play out politically, but the immediate effect of this is the U.S. government had to show Qatar, look, we're your good pals.
That agreement that they wrote for Qatar, it even included military interference if necessary, it said, which is more that they've done for Ukraine.
Yeah,
which was
absolutely.
just ironic. But I want to move on because we don't have long.
Yeah,
Sources
sure.
are telling MSNBC that a federal grand jury in Maryland has been considering charges against former National Security Advisor John Bolton for weeks. John Bolton, who comes on the Trump Report, he is reportedly about to be indicted on criminal charges potentially as early as next week. Tying him to keeping classified government documents at his house after leaving government. His lawyer maintains that he's done nothing wrong. But, Scott, this is the third former critic of Trump, including James Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James, to face indictment. So, I mean, are we looking at this situation thinking that Trump is operating his own witch hunt?
What does an authoritarian do? He goes after his political enemies. I mean, it's as simple as that. The Justice Department does not function as an independent department to protect the American people. It now functions to carry out Trump's orders. Hi, Pam Bondi. It was great talking about you in our last discussion. I'm sure she's still doing great work. And so, you know, Trump put out an enemies list that he wanted the Justice Department to prosecute. Indeed, in one of the stunning moments, why we know this? Because he meant to send a direct message to Pam Bondi on Truth Social, and he sent it as a tweet. Right, Pam, why are you not doing your job? Go get these people, right? And so the first one who went was Comey on a case that has almost no evidence. How did Trump do that? Trump did that by putting in one of his personal attorneys who had no prosecutorial experience when the previous prosecutor resigned and said, I'm not going to do this. And so Trump put this person in, Lindsey Halligan. Guess who Lindsey Halligan showed up to file the indictment on this past week? Letitia James, the New York Attorney General. Let me give the basic facts and then give you the stinger in the tail of this and why it may be more, not just John Bolton, but it might be the former special prosecutor, Jack Smith, who did the investigation of January the 6th. And 2 minutes, and I'll wrap this all up for you, nice and smooth. Here we go. So Letitia James is the person who successfully, and I emphasize that word successfully, prosecuted the Trump Organization, which had to pay one of the largest settlements in New York State history, ultimately more than $500 million, or they were ordered to pay it. It's now on hold because an appellate court has said maybe it's excessive. But they were found guilty of one of the most serious frauds in New York State histories. Not my words, the words of the judge. This case was, I can go through the evidence. There was substantial evidence that they had committed fraud over their valuations, both for tax and for loan purposes, specifically valuation of properties. Trump doesn't like when he loses, and he doesn't like it when he possibly loses money. So he goes after Letitia James. How does he do that? He puts in the personal attorney, Lindsay Halligan. And here's where the story gets interesting. Letitia James had bought a property for her grandniece in Virginia, about $135,000 property. The claim of the prosecutors is that she lied that it was her primary property. From what we know about the case, it appears that the most serious thing that she might have done is she might have accidentally checked a wrong box. Everything else was in order on the mortgage application. But by ticking that box, there's a guy named Bill Pulte, who is a Trump lackey, who's the head of the Federal Housing Mortgage Administration, FHMA, who has access to everyone's mortgage records. He combed these records of Trump's so-called political enemies to try to find something. He then teamed up with a Justice Department official, a lawyer with a very checkered record named Ed Martin. They put this together because they want to serve the master. So that's why they go after Letitia James. At the very least, it inconveniences her. She's got to hire lawyers. She's got to show up in court. Trump wants to tie down his folks, and he wants to belittle American belief in the rule of law. Because here's the stinger. If he can do it to a former director of the FBI, if he can do it to a former attorney general, if he can do it to a man who was national security advisor, if he can do it to a man who was a special prosecutor, no one who serves as a judge, as a prosecutor, as an investigator, no one is safe. It's Trump ruling by fear. And I'll tie this all together. There's a man named Stephen Miller, who is perhaps the most important person after Donald Trump in the Trump administration. Stephen Miller did two things this week that are telling. But first of all, he said that Donald Trump can do anything he wants to because he has plenary authority. Now, that doesn't exist as a concept in U.S. law. There's no such thing as plenary authority, but that's what Miller claimed it. This is the same Stephen Miller who, when a judge ruled against the Trump administration this week in one of the myriad cases over migrants, over tariffs, over military in U.S. cities, said these radical judges are illegitimate. So make no secret about it. It is serious for Letitia James, but it's also serious as part of what's happening in the United States system, because you are at the authoritarian moment, whether or not, well, next year, Maddie, you and I could be talking about the first authoritarian in U.S. history to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Won't that be a happy day?
Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you.